Well, hello again and good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar, Zoomers and the Secret Power of Virtue. This is an exciting topic to discuss these days. I'm Dr. Gordon E. Kartner, and I welcome you to this seminar, this webinar. I'm an author, a blogger, a webinar producer, and a meta educator. At the moment, I support faculty and graduate students and important dialogue at the University of British Columbia. Our motto in this whole project is to keep thinking, to never stop thinking. We want to talk about Generation Z. I speak as a Canadian, so I use the term Z. Colloquially known as Zoomers, Gen Z is the demographic cohort succeeding millennials. Researchers and popular media use the mid to late 1990s as the starting birth years and the early 2010s as the ending birth years. So just in that period. Some of the characteristics of Gen Z are they're quite diverse, pragmatic, politically progressive. They do carry some mental health concerns that we should pay attention to. And of course, they are the first digital natives where they born and grew up in the internet age. Here are some of the key markers. Generation Z considers itself more accepting and open-minded than any generation before it. Almost half are minorities compared to 22% of baby boomers. The majority of this generation supports social movements such as Black Lives Matter, transgender rights, and climate change concerns. They're socially minded, independent thinkers with hopes for a more equitable future. They're both excited and intimidated by rapid change and complexity. I suppose we all are. So first of all, diversity is the norm. They are the last predominantly white generation open to diversity, integration of races, various gender orientations, and philosophical beliefs. They're digital natives. They grew up amidst peak tech innovation. They have high access to knowledge, but remain still socially isolated, overly addicted to social media and the influencers or fan culture. Here are some of their mental health challenges. There's loneliness, anxiety, and depression at new levels than we've seen for a while. They suffer from the comparison trap, lack of meaningful relationships, and they see a world that seems on edge. Awareness of too much evil can lead them to a loss of faith in humanity itself. Some of the side effects still remain from the isolation during COVID. But they long for meaning and purpose, stronger individual identity, and freedom. Overall, they are looking for a vision to captivate them. That's important to remember. Politically progressive, as we've already said, more left-leaning than millennials, champion climate change concerns and LGBTQ plus rights, equity and status of opportunity. So they're very social justice oriented. And finally, they're pragmatic. They're, as we all are, intimidated by high rents. They want interesting and stable jobs. They want a home. They want to be able to purchase their own home. They really long for work-life balance, as a Time magazine article pointed out. And they don't want big student debt burden at the end of their undergrad career. So we propose in this video that they are well suited for a very creative relationship to the virtues, which is what we're on about today. Identity, morality, spirituality. How do these things relate? We want to move towards a thick, resilient self by connecting this generation with the virtues. One of my favorite philosophers, Charles Taylor, shows in Sources of the Self and his last great volume, The Language Animal, that our identity is interwoven with our morality and spirituality. Thus, in this video, we focus on the importance of virtues to help this generation build moral fiber and confidence. What is the virtue worldview? In this worldview, life is an upward journey towards virtue, requiring patience and perseverance. Within virtue thinking, we attempt to connect the big picture to the big picture, studying the links between the various aspects of our lives. Virtues help us integrate rather than disintegrate, commune rather than isolate. I encourage you to see David Brooks' important book, The Road to Character. We'll be talking about that a bit later. That's where he tells several impressive stories of exemplary people who exhibited at least one strong character trait. There was one thing, as in the movie, A River Runs Through It. There was one character trait that ran through their whole life and their whole sense of motivation. So we know now that good outcomes in identity, life, and healthy relationships take time or the long journey. They are empowered by regular investment. If Gen Z is to grow more resilient, then the embrace of virtue is a necessity. And psychologist Angela Duckworth would agree. She calls it grit, or the combination of passion and perseverance. So these are the kind of things we need to encourage in this generation, this wonderful generation. So let's turn to the topic of virtue and how that integrates. Virtue is experiencing a significant revival in culture and study in academia. A philosophy professor in Sweden, Dr. Paul Russell, was given a multi-million euro grant to do research on virtue. That shows that it's becoming quite important. People are now realizing that following Aristotle, it is vital to human flourishing. What is the path of virtue recovery? And this we want to contrast with the language of values, as in Max Weber. The language of values is often much more popular today in the vernacular, but virtues is the one we want to drill down into. We want to see the depth of virtue and its impact. A virtue, by definition, is a state of praiseworthy character with the attendant desires, attitudes, and emotions. Formed by choices over time, a virtue predisposes us to act in certain excellent ways. Knowing the truly excellent way involves avoiding the extremes of vice by looking to people of virtue as role models. As virtues shape our character, they improve how we see the world. The entire process of forming virtues is shaped by a particular narrative and community. This settled disposition to act well, which makes us who we are, is nurtured by the stories we imbibe and the communities of which we are a part. This comes from Stephen Buma Prediger in his book, For the Beauty of the Earth. He's a creation philosopher, theologian. So we note that virtue is something we intentionally think about. And here we move towards sourcing the virtues. Virtue discourse starts with Aristotle in the ancient world, then Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and on to Alistair MacIntyre today. These are the big figures. Here are some examples of virtue: humility, wisdom, forgiveness, gratitude, moral courage, truth orientation, integrity, care for the poor, justice, frugality, benevolence, patience, self-restraint, respect, and receptivity. There are many more, but there is an art, a joy, a creativity, a finesse to virtue. That's important to remember. To embrace virtue involves living deeply, prayerfully, circumspectly, hopefully, expectantly, optimistically. Aristotle promoted the four capital or hinge virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, So it's important to realize that these have been around since the ancient world. And Christianity added faith, hope, and love to Aristotle. Now, in the modern era, Alistair McIntyre in After Virtue was worried that we had lost virtue in Western culture discourse, and he was working to improve that. We'll see later that the fruits of the Spirit are added virtues which enter the stage through the Christian Revolution, as well as faith, hope, and love. And it's important to note, as does atheist historian Tom Holland in his important book, Dominion, that he is worried about how Western civilization will survive as a civil society in a post-Christian or post-religious era. So now we turn to our first virtue, a capital virtue called wisdom. This has been around since ancient times. So let's talk about wisdom or discernment, a foundational virtue. Yale psychologist Robert Sternberg writes this: wisdom is involved when practical intelligence is applied to maximizing not just one's own or someone else's self-interest, but rather a balance of various self-interests, which are intrapersonal. Balance them with interests of others, interpersonal, and of other aspects of the context in which one lives, those extrapersonal dimensions, such as one's city or country or environment or even God. So this, he's articulating what's called the hermeneutical stance, looking at virtue from the big picture perspective. Wisdom is the foundational virtue, a commitment to grow in insight and character throughout one's whole life journey. It's a core concept, a posture which entails the management of the other virtues as well. It requires the full picture, the natural and purposeful end of our moral and physical capacities and intentions. All this towards a flourishing human life. Notice how positive virtue is. And you can look at James 3:15 to 18 to get a picture of that. The Berlin Wisdom Project pairs the knowledge with wisdom. So first of all, it talks about factual knowledge or data sets, procedural knowledge, how to accomplish a task like building a bridge in engineering. And they're saying that wisdom requires the full context of decisions, not just those kind of decisions, that kind of data. For instance, lifespan contextualism, it is sensitive to the past, present, and future span of things. And then pluralism, which we're all familiar with, it assumes competing values or convictions are at work in any situation. And don't we know that? And then managing uncertainty and complexity. Wisdom understands that not all things go according to plan or principle, which means your ability to pivot or to adjust to the situation at hand. From a Christian perspective, wisdom is something like this. Craig Koskela says, wisdom comes from the history of regular individual and corporate practices that lead to making decisions in line with the character of Christ. That is in the dimensions of relational, spiritual, embodied, generated from years of practice. This is also called discipleship. Spiritual directors agree with this, and the Apostle Paul writes, Jesus is the wisdom of God in 1 Corinthians 1:24. Do we not all need wisdom every day of our lives? Recently, I've come to discover that the movie series, The Chosen, really engages Generation Z with a modern take on Jesus. And that's really fascinating. Now, a side note here, we want to talk about the relationship between science and wisdom using our colleague Tom McLeish from England. He's one of our favorite interlocutors at UBC on wisdom. And he talks about a theology of science from his book, The Poetry and Music of Science. Science becomes a moral and spiritual exercise in personal and corporate healing and flourishing. The embedding of the scientific imagination within a much larger narrative of human advancement towards the divine constitutes a modern echo of the narrative described by Anselm and Grosseteste in their own medieval time, but emerging within a new experimental program of Enlightenment science. Further, he says in the book, the other brilliant book, Faith and Wisdom in Science, both a long narrative of science and the biblical story of our relationship with nature agree that we start from a position of ignorance and, driven by seemingly unreasonable hope, work to achieve an ever deeper understanding. Both need to assume a linear history with a past, present, and future, that we can make progress, of course. The task of eroding ignorance about the world becomes a project that humankind is compelled to adopt. And one more quote from Tom on the idea of science as reconciliation, which shows you the cross purposes of wisdom in both sciences, humanities, and theology. A theology of science assumes a special human attitude for wisdom. In fact, the most inexplicable thing about science is that it is explicable. That's one of the mysteries of science. It also seeks deep wisdom. There's deeper significance to understanding nature than simply knowing things or facts. And then the role of questioning and love in the practice of science and participation in reconciliation. So in this light, science becomes the grounded outworking of the ministry of reconciliation between humankind and the world. I think that's a wonderful articulation of an important perspective. So this is the big picture that Tom offers us of knowledge and wisdom. These are important things to realize. So there are further discussion on wisdom. I want to point out the two types of wisdom: conventional wisdom and critical wisdom. Conventional wisdom is that common sense guidelines for living the good life and becoming a good person. And, basically becoming a productive family member and citizen. You can find lots of advice on this in the book of Proverbs. And then critical wisdom. For instance, Jesus challenged many of the religious systems of wisdom in place in his time. If you look at his Sermon on the Mount, he challenges people's understanding of virtuous living. His wisdom is often countercultural, always discerning, sometimes mysterious, involving the odd social grenade. But he's always digging deeper in wisdom. This displays the out-of-the-box thinking of Jesus with a high commitment to justice and goodness. For example, Jesus shows incredible kindness and warmth towards the disadvantaged, even while he expresses outrage at the injustice of calcified religion of his day. He stands up to treachery, greed, and oppression. So it's important to reflect in summary that virtues like wisdom impact the scientific, religious, aesthetic, and ethical culture spheres. And we can note that suffering can lead to wisdom and bring us together. So let's reflect a bit on Jesus and moral wisdom, or wisdom as a moral courage or resistance to harmful social trends. Jesus, the perfect image of God, is the master of critical wisdom, says Mark McMinn. He didn't come to abolish the traditional wisdom, but to enliven it, to flesh out the greatest commandments of loving God and loving neighbor as self, to remind us of life's deep mystery and to call us back to the fear and awe of God. We so easily settle for a religion composed of cognitive beliefs and behavioral lists, and we feel good about ourselves. It makes us feel holier than others. So for a deeper dive into the life of Jesus and his wisdom, I suggest N.T. Wright's series called The Gifford Lectures in 2018. This material is available online. Wonderful stuff. Okay, now we look at the ancient idea of wisdom and modern science, or the science of wisdom, which we find in positive psychology. Wisdom as the key virtue of virtues. So how do we become wise? It seems that researchers are telling us there is a critical development window which applies to Generation Z. Wisdom increases from ages 13 to 25. It then remains roughly the same after 30. And we now know about brain wiring. Major brain wiring occurs to the prefrontal cortex, according to current neuroscientists at this time. Here's an example of the research Francis Jensen and Amy Nutt in the teenage brain. Thus, we see the relevance to Zoomers, do we not? Now, on the other hand, we have a knowledge tsunami in today's internet age, a knowledge tsunami of social media. So education today is more about wisdom, less about just gathering information. The key skill needed is the ability to sift and sort credible sources, understanding good data from bad data, and then to discern good application to the issue at hand. I think this is kind of wisdom in a nutshell. Wisdom helps one in what's called post-formal thought, i.e., the ability to think about complex issues in flexible ways. For example, we learn through dialogue even while we disagree with someone. It requires that we appreciate nuances and grasp motivational complexity. We are complex beings as human beings. Charles Taylor calls this the palette of assumptions, motives, and sensibilities in complex human relationships, whether that's in a family, in a business, an educational institution, or health institution. We find this everywhere. Now we pause for a moment for a mourning of our cultural amnesia with respect to virtue. How did we lose the language of virtue? And the idea of community consciousness, the idea of building in virtue over a lifetime. This was once part of our culture in the West, especially, and in most cultures. So Brad Gregory, an early modern historian from Notre Dame University, helps us out here. He says this to give us perspective. At one time, the language of human rights, for instance, was articulated within values of the communal good, within the discourse of the virtuous community. In late modernity, these rights have morphed into a consumeristic entitlement commodity. That is, to fulfill my subjective desires, assert my opinions, dominate or be dominated by others. This is what's well known today as the autonomous individual. He warns us, the loss of virtue consciousness is threatening our very freedoms, our dignity and rights, even democracy itself. It requires certain virtues. The moderating voice of virtue and thus wisdom has been muted in today's political environment, for instance. So that's sad, and it's something to mourn, but there is good news on the other hand. The good news, however, is that virtue theory and discourse is being revived with serious quest and zest in the universities today. So we want to talk now about the power of virtue recovery and how it can impact today's Generation Z. And we turn to David Brooks's idea of virtue in The Road to Character and his second book, The Second Mountain. Brilliant articulations of virtue in both of them. In this, he talks about the difference between Adam 1 and Adam 2 to help us in our modern consciousness. Adam 1 refers to our career success, fame, wealth, and personal self-actualization goals. So he says this is the first mountain, and many of us are climbing this with great energy. Adam 2 refers to the deeper things of formation, like virtue, character, quality of relationships, and personal integrity. He refers to this, helpfully, as the second mountain, and some of us never quite get to it. Today's society is far too focused on Adam 1, he says, but very weak on growing into mature Adam 2. So, in this sense, we can conquer the world and lose our own family or our own soul. We can sell our soul for success. At the end of the day, Adam 2, character, virtue, wisdom, is essential to good employment and experience, healthy family relations, and a meaningful, responsible contribution, as in citizenship or civility. So we want to begin to take this further in applying the language and the theory of virtue to everyday life. And here we find that there's real identity strength through the virtue of humility. It allows an accurate view of oneself. It gives us the ability to acknowledge mistakes and limitations, openness to new ideas or teachability, keeps one's accomplishment and abilities in perspective. That is, we show respect for others' success as well. It's relatively low on self-focus. One attends well to others. We don't need the last word in a conversation or debate. Humility appreciates diversity of peoples, different perspectives, while being confident in my viewpoint. And finally, perspective on my position before God, creation or nature, and society. I am deeply loved, but deeply flawed, called to grow towards a better self. I'm willing to struggle against personal weakness. I determine to think better and do better. So in summary of this, we see that virtue is something in which we can make progress, and that's very encouraging. Now we want to move towards the discussion of virtue and the results that it produces, the practical outcome from things like humility. Great humility is associated with greater physical health, greater mental health or self-esteem, gratitude and forgiveness, academic performance, job performance, generosity and helpfulness. People experience more positive romantic relationships, form and repair social bonds more readily, and are less anxious about death. They're more compassionate and experience less spiritual struggle. This is according to the research by Mark McMinn. There's a huge volume of positive psychology research on such virtues, especially since 2000. I attended recently a conference on positive psychology and was quite impressed. Now, the Cambridge Compassion on Virtue Ethics is quite a summary of a lot of discussion in this area as well. But it's important to see that researchers do find a negative correlation between humility and our age of social media and narcissistic self-promotion, as in TikTok, and the comparison trap, which with its festering self-loathing. So humility is indeed countercultural these days, but very fruitful in our lives. Here's a couple of the books that I've been talking about: The Science of Virtue and Virtue Ethics. The research is expanding, and there's lots to dig into if you're a graduate student interested in this area. Now we move to another virtue, gratitude, or the grace-oriented life. Leading experts Emmons and McCullough say this: gratitude journaling leads to increased optimism and favorable life ratings. Such intervention and practice results in an upward spiral, more pro-social and attuned to social networks and how these social networks bring love and belonging. It promotes spiritual awareness, broadens emotional and cognitive flexibility, helps one resist stress. The result or the research on this virtue has literally exploded, showing mental, physical, and spiritual health. Don't we all want these characteristics in our lives? It is associated with positive mood, pleasantness, self-esteem, life satisfaction, low risk of depression, anxiety disorders, nicotine dependence, alcohol and drug abuse. People are less materialistic, more motivated, and have stronger cardiovascular health. And a word or two on grace resilience. It offers perspective when life comes under stress. Thomas Merton, a famous American Trappist monk, writes, "To be grateful is to recognize the love of God in everything he has given, and he has given us everything. Every breath we draw is a gift of love. Every moment of existence is a grace, for it brings with it immense graces from Him. Gratitude takes nothing for granted, is never unresponsive, is constantly awakening to new wonder and to praise of the goodness of God. For the grateful person knows that God is good, not by hearsay, but by experience. I read recently a wonderful book by Anne Voskamp, so of her reflections on life, called 1,000 Gifts, where she talks about grace resilience in her daily life with raising a large family. On the pastoral relevance of gratitude, pastor, theologian, celebrated author Eugene Peterson says this: in 50 years of being a pastor, my most difficult assignment continues to be the task of developing a sense among the people I serve of the soul transforming implications of grace, a comprehensive foundational reorientation from living anxiously by my wits and muscle to living effortlessly in the world of God's active presence. The prevailing North American culture, not much different from the Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Roman cultures in which our biblical ancestors lived, is to all intents and purposes a context of persistent denial of grace. And we've said before that the Christianity added the fruits of the Spirit to the list of virtues, things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This is from Galatians 5:22 and 23. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all experience and exhibit this kind of virtue and this kind of culture? 2 Peter 1:3-8 talks about the importance of growing in virtue or confirming one's calling. It says, His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through a knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. Through these, He has given us His very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world caused by evil desires. For this very reason, make every effort to your faith, to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection love. I remember a conference run by the C.S. Lewis Society, which talked about the importance of going up the mountain of virtue, to travel up the mountain. And finally, in Philippians 4:8, a verse that always reminded me to keep growing in virtue from wherever I was at the time. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. This is completely the opposite to the culture of cynicism, which we often find in our world. So this is the social imaginary of virtue. This is how morality, spirituality, and identity come together. And I want us to watch virtue build resilience in those we love and those we work with, build social, spiritual, and mental health. We know from research that narcissism has increased from 30% to 70% among college students since the 1980s. Social scientists predict that it will be 75% by 2030. That's quite significant. But virtues like empathy, servanthood, and self-responsibility can be a healing agent in a countercultural direction. We can build in accountability at all levels, combined with affirmation, a supportive environment with lots of constructive feedback. We can assist young people in finding good mentors. At the same time, we should trust them with a good measure of independence, promoting responsible stewardship. They will listen to people, of course, who live their talk or have integrity, people who live the talk of virtue. It's strategic to encourage thoughtful group projects, collaboration, and community thinking to build virtue. We can add in group assessment to develop social and emotional intelligence. So, virtue thinking can help Zoomers reduce social media consumption, which is often toxic to healthy self-worth, promoting an epidemic of anxiety. One student recently said online that he noted he feels so much better now that he has cut back from 7 hours to 2 hours per day on social media. I guess it is time to go out for a hike with a friend. And it's important in this context to realize a cultural phenomena that sort of jumps out at us in today's world. The West is the wealthiest and most powerful part of the world, yet it also contains some of the most anxious people. Together, we need to transcend fear, shame, hatred, and resentment. And Charles Taylor says that we can do this through a transcendent turn to agape love. So, what is the impact of virtue for Zoomers, the potential impact? This is a critical age for shaping virtues for spiritual formation and character development. We've observed this age as a key window of opportunity. Presently, Zoomers are poorly served in learning about the power of virtue, the secret power of virtue, and the importance of character. I would say by home, universities, sports communities, church, and society. So it is something we need to revive, and hopefully we can. And yet, it is the very age when they respond best to such mentorship and character development intervention. Self-obsession can be turned into servanthood. Meaning and purpose can grow. Anxiety can retreat with deeper connections and mutual accountability. I'm encouraged because positive psychology fruitfully affirms the existential and life-enhancing value of virtue. As Mark McMinn says, it works. So here we are in conclusion, at the end of our discussion. Let's collect our thoughts. Virtue recovery is critical for younger generations. Choice and freedom, autonomy and expressive individualism is not enough. Pursuit of happiness will not deliver. That's not enough. Virtue infrastructure needs to be reaffirmed and rebuilt for both survival and fulfillment, for meaning and significance, or core identity construction. It makes us more interesting as we commit to self-discipline and personal character growth. Life is hard and we need all the help we can get to navigate the world outside as well as inside. Perhaps we can even recover the image of God in Generation Z. Secondly, this will require a new team of wise mentors focused on supporting Zoomers to take responsibility for critical moral growth, fresh articulation, and serious character goals. That is the second mountain transformation. This applies to teachers, to business leaders, to people leading in all realms of life. They need wise, older people and peers to walk alongside them, to encourage and draw them out. This will help them make sense of self and build hope for moral, spiritual identity progress and strength and resilience. They need creative spaces for community and dialogical engagement to sort through these issues. This will help mitigate their anxiety and grow their confidence. We have claimed at the end of the day that the Jesus story and agape love is a key part of the answer to growing in virtue. Jesus is an amazing mentor, exemplary, and interlocutor. So thanks for joining this video, this presentation. We want to inform, to inspire, and to bring hope to today's generation, younger generations, and to their elders as well. So never stop thinking and growing in virtue. We just have a bibliography here with further, for those who want to do further investigation. Here are some of the resources that I've talked about, and you can take time with that on your own. I do have a blog here on the UBC GCU website. which talks about virtues applied to our relationship to creation. That's something I haven't talked about. And then Linda Zagzebski's talks about virtues of the mind, an important discussion of honesty, truthfulness, even-handedness, and sagacity. And then there is a nice YouTube video by N.T. Wright, After You Believe Why Christian Character Matters. And he draws out some of the issues and some of the history of virtue as well. So thanks very much for joining me in this video. I really appreciate the time you're taking out to think about virtue and this generation. Everything you can do in this area is a bonus and very, very helpful. So thanks and all the best in your journey of growing in virtue.